The Arizona sun cast long shadows on the reddish earth when Elena Navarro first glimpsed the Lone Eagle Ranch. The dust from the road had stuck to her skin like a second nature, mixing with sweat and uncertainty. Her hands, which once knew the delicate touch of books in her father's library in Madrid, now firmly held the reins of a borrowed horse and a cracked leather suitcase containing all her memories. The warm wind caressed the tips of the mesquite, trees tearing whispers from them that seemed like warnings. Elena narrowed her eyes. In the distance, the main house of the ranch stood like a ship anchored in a sea of earth and solitude. The wooden boards, tanned by the relentless sun, spoke of resistance, of permanence, just what she needed to find after 3 years, wandering through a country that remained strange to her. Her father's death in Spain had unleashed a storm that dragged her to America, where the promises of a distant cousin dissolved like salt in water upon discovering that he too had perished, leaving her without contacts and with someone else's debts. The wrinkled letter in her pocket, her last hope, mentioned that in this ranch lost on the horizon, they accepted working hands without asking too many questions. Elena dismounted with a movement that revealed her lack of practice. Her legs trembled not only from the fatigue of the journey, but from the weight of what she was about to do: ask for work, beg for a place, become one more of those uprooted women that the West consumed without compassion. The empty corral and silent stables suggested a strange calm for an active ranch. Only the distant barking of an invisible dog betrayed human presence. Elena adjusted her worn blue dress, the only one that retained some dignity, and moved toward the house. Each step raised small clouds of dust that danced briefly before returning to the earth. The porch door creaked as a male figure emerged from the inner shadows. Elena held her breath. The man who appeared before her had skin tanned by the sun and eyes the color of wet earth after a storm. He wasn't particularly tall, but something in his posture conveyed a silent authority, as if every inch of that territory responded to his voice. "You're on private property," he said in Spanish, with a northern accent that surprised Elena. She straightened her back. The words rehearsed over miles of road crowded in her throat, but she managed to articulate them with a dignity she thought lost. "My name is Elena Navarro. I've come for the job." The man studied her without disguise, evaluating every fold of her dress, every shadow under her eyes. There was no lust in his gaze, only the cold calculation of one who measures the resistance of a horse or the firmness of a beam. "There's no work for lone women at the Lone Eagle," he finally responded. The wind seemed to stop. The birds fell, silent. And in that silence, Elena felt something inside her break, the last branch of hope she had clung to during the journey. Mateo Salazar observed the woman in front of him, noticing how her knuckles whitened as she gripped the handle of her suitcase. There was something about her that didn't fit with the other women who occasionally came to the ranch looking for fortune or escaping from their past. Her eyes, of an intense green that contrasted with her dark hair, didn't avoid his gaze. They maintained a silent challenge, a dignity that the road dust had not managed to tarnish. "I can cook," said Elena, and her voice emerged firmer than she felt. "I can keep accounts, speak 3 languages, and I can learn any necessary task." A flock of ravens crossed the sky, their cawing like mocking laughter. Mateo leaned against one of the porch columns. His shirt, rolled up to the elbows, revealed strong forearms and old scars. "Languages aren't much use when speaking with cattle," he responded with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And I keep the accounts myself." Elena felt the ground dissolving beneath her feet. She had ridden 3 days following rumors of this ranch, spending her last coins on scarce food and muddy water. If she turned back now, she would have nowhere to go. Mateo seemed to read her thoughts. "There is one possibility," he said after a silence that stretched like the shadows of the evening. "But I don't think you'd be interested." Elena's heart skipped a beat. A small flame of hope lit in her chest. "Tell me what it is," she replied, trying to control the tremor in her voice. Mateo directed his gaze toward the horizon, where the last rays of sun were setting the clouds ablaze. "I need a wife," he said with the same naturalness with which he might have mentioned needing a new horse. "Before that sun touches the horizon." The words fell between them like stones in a pond, creating ripples of disbelief. Elena blinked, sure she had misheard. Wife, she stammered. You must be joking. I never joke about business, Miss Navarro, he replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested that indeed for him this was nothing more than a transaction. I have a land claim in La Mesa Verde. The government requires that the settler be married to validate the property. Tomorrow is the last day to submit the documentation. Elena let out an incredulous laugh that almost sounded like a sob, and, You expect me to... We don't even know each other. It wouldn't be a real marriage, Matteo clarified, and his eyes met hers. Just on paper, you will have your own room, a fair salary, and my word that you will be treated with respect. When enough time has passed to validate the claim, you can leave if you wish. Silence settled between them again, interrupted only by the distant mooing of a cow. Elena contemplated the man in front of her, looking for signs of madness or cruelty, but found only determination and perhaps a flash of desperation that mirrored her own. Why me? She finally asked. Surely there are women in town who... I've looked for them, he interrupted. 2 have rejected the offer at the last moment. There was something he wasn't saying, some piece that was missing in that puzzle. But the sun kept descending, and with it, Elena's options. I want to be free to leave when I wish, she said, surprising herself by considering such madness, and a written agreement. Matteo nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly that response. Judge Fuentes is waiting for us in Valle Sereno, he said, and the us sounded strange to Elena's ears. If we leave now, we'll arrive before nightfall. The town of Valle Sereno was barely a collection of low wooden and adobe buildings that seemed to emerge directly from the reddish earth. The few people walking the main street stopped to observe the carriage transporting Matteo and Elena. She could feel the gazes boring into her back like small needles. Don't pay attention to them, said Matteo, noticing her discomfort. Novelty is the only entertainment they have. Judge Fuentes' office was located above the only general store in town. As they climbed the narrow staircase, Elena felt that each step brought her closer to an irrevocable decision. The blue dress, now covered in dust, seemed to mock her pretensions. Of dignity. The judge was a small man with a thick mustache and eyes that seemed to have seen all possible tragedies in the territory. He looked up from some papers when they entered, and a tired sigh escaped his lips. Salazar, he said with familiarity, before directing his gaze at Elena. I see you found another one. Elena's heart skipped a beat. Another one. The word echoed, in her head like an echo in an empty canyon. She wanted to turn around, escape from that suffocating room, but Matteo's hand rested lightly on her back, not to hold her back, but to support her. Elena Navarro, he introduced her. She has accepted the terms. The judge studied Elena with a gaze that seemed to pierce through her, as if he could read every doubt, every fear, every desperate hope that had led her there. Do you understand what you're doing, Miss Navarro? He asked with a surprisingly gentle voice. A marriage, even one of convenience, is a serious matter before the law. Elena found her voice in some deep place within herself. I understand, Your Honor, and I have freely accepted. The judge nodded, though his eyes still reflected doubts. He took some documents from a drawer and arranged them on the table. With methodical movements, he explained each paragraph, each clause. Matteo had kept his word. There, her right to her own room, a monthly salary, to leave when she considered it appropriate after a year of cohabitation was stipulated. The pen trembled slightly in Elena's hand when she signed. The black ink spread over the yellowish paper, forming the letters of a name that now seemed to belong to someone else. By the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife, declared the judge with the same emotion with which he might have announced the time of day. You may kiss the bride. The silence that followed seemed to contain the entire desert. Matteo turned to Elena, and for the first time she saw something akin to discomfort in his impassive face. Finally he leaned in and deposited the briefest of kisses on her cheek. The contact was fleeting, but Elena felt the warmth of his lips long after he pulled away. As they descended the stairs, now as husband and wife before the law, Elena felt as if Shai Chui were moving in a dream. Reality had folded in on itself, transforming her from a woman without destiny to the wife of a stranger in the space of an afternoon. "Who were the others?" she asked when they were already in the carriage moving away from the town. Matteo kept his gaze fixed on the road. The twilight bathed his profile in a golden light that softened his hard features. "Women who believed they could accept the deal," he replied after a long silence, "until they heard the stories about me." "What stories?" Elena insisted, although a part of her feared the answer. Matteo's sigh seemed to come from a deep and dark place. "They say I killed a man," he finally said, and his words hung suspended in the air between them. "That I'm dangerous, that I have a past that follows me like a shadow." Elena studied his profile silhouetted against the reddish sky. She should feel afraid, she thought. She should be regretting her decision, but instead she only felt a strange calm. "We all have shadows, Mr. Salazar," she responded softly. "Some of us carry them inside where nobody can see them." The Lone Eagle Ranch came alive at dawn the next day. Elena, who had barely slept in her assigned room, a sober but clean chamber in the east wing of the house, was awakened by the noise of workers in the yard. From the small window, she could see men saddling horses, loading tools, preparing for the day. She dressed in one of the 2 dresses she owned, brushed her dark hair, and contemplated herself in the small cracked mirror hanging on the wall. Her eyes returned a look of strangeness. Who was this woman who had married a stranger? What had Elena Navarro become? The kitchen was empty when she entered. A black iron stove dominated the space, cold and silent like a sleeping beast. In the cupboard, she found flour, coffee, beans, and some basic seasonings. The pantry revealed dried meat, somewhat wilted vegetables, and canned goods. It was evident that the kitchen had gone a long time without a hand to organize it. With determined movements, Eleanor lit the stove and put water to heat. While waiting, she toured the house with contained curiosity. The main room, with its worn but dignified furniture, contained a small library that caught her attention. The spines of the books revealed titles in English and Spanish, agricultural manuals, some classics, a worn copy of Don Quixote. She ran her fingers over them, feeling an unexpected connection with the man who had gathered them. A sound of boots on wood alerted her. Matteo entered the room, surprised to find her there. He wore work clothes and a hat that he removed upon. Seeing her, an automatic gesture that spoke of a formal education at some point in his life. "Good morning," he said, and the formality between them seemed absurd considering their new condition. "I didn't expect to find you up so early." "I've put on coffee," Elena replied, noticing how domestic she sounded, as if they had been sharing routines for years. "And I was thinking of preparing breakfast." Matteo nodded, and an uncomfortable silence settled between them. They were strangers, united by a paper, sharing a space that suddenly seemed too small. "The men have already had breakfast," he finally said. "They usually get up with the first rooster crow. But I would appreciate some coffee." In the kitchen, as Eleanor served, 2 cups of the dark, steaming liquid. She thought about how surreal the situation was. 24 hours earlier, she had been desperate at the edge of a dusty road. Now she was, at least nominally, the lady of a ranch. "I must leave for La Mesa Verde this morning," Matteo announced after drinking his coffee in silence. "To register the property with the new documents. I'll return at nightfall." Elena nodded, feeling a contradictory mixture of relief at his absence and anxiety about being left alone in an unknown place. "The house and ranch will be in your charge while I'm away," he continued. "Doña Carmen, the cook, will come at noon to prepare lunch for the workers, and Tomas, the foreman, will take care of the cattle." "I understand," Elena replied, although in reality she understood nothing about ranches or rural responsibilities. Matteo seemed to perceive her concern. He rose and went to a small secretary desk in the corner of the room. From one of the drawers, he extracted an object that he offered to Eleanor. It was an old key, made of forged iron, heavy and with intricate designs. "It's the key to the house," he explained. "To all the doors, including my office. It's your home now, too." The cold metal against her palm had a weight that went beyond the physical. It was a symbol of trust, of belonging, however precarious it might be. Eleanor closed her fingers around the key, feeling that something was transforming inside her. Thank you, she murmured, and the word seemed insufficient. Matteo nodded briefly and headed for the door. Before leaving, he stopped, as if wanting to say something more. The morning sun outlined his silhouette in the doorway, transforming him for an instant into an almost mythical figure. "Elena," he said, using her first name for the first time, "what they said in town about me, not everything is true, but not everything is a lie either. Someday, perhaps, I'll tell you my story." And with those enigmatic words, he disappeared into the blinding light outside, leaving behind a trail of questions without answers and the echo of her name on the lips of a man who was her husband only, on paper. La Mesa Verde arose on the horizon like a vision from another world, an elevated plain that extended green and promising, in brutal contrast to the dry land that surrounded it. Matteo contemplated the extension of land he had so coveted, feeling a mixture of pride and apprehension. The half-built cabin at the southern end was barely visible from where he stood, a constant reminder of interrupted dreams. The property registration had been surprisingly simple. The official had barely looked at the marriage papers before stamping his seal on the land claim. Now, officially, La Mesa Verde belonged to Matteo and Elena Salazar. Her name, alongside his in the official document, had provoked a strange sensation. In his chest, something for which he had no name. He dismounted from his horse and approached the cabin. The walls were half raised, the roof beams partially placed. He had begun construction 6 months ago, working only on weekends, obstinate, in his dream of creating something lasting, something that nobody could take from him. He ran his hand over the rough wood, thinking of his father. Luis Salazar had died without seeing his dream of owning a piece of land that nobody could dispute realized, land where his children could grow without the constant fear of being displaced, as had happened to so many Mexicans after the war. A movement in the distance caught his attention. Ernesto Vega was riding toward him, his dark figure silhouetted against the sky like a bad omen. Matteo involuntarily tensed his jaw. Vega was the owner of the neighboring ranch, an ambitious man who had been trying to appropriate La Mesa Verde for years. "Salazar," Vega greeted upon arrival without dismounting. "I was told in town that you finally found someone desperate enough to marry you." Matteo kept his face impassive, although he felt anger boiling beneath his skin. "Miss Navarro is now my wife, yes," he responded with a calm he didn't feel. "And La Mesa Verde is officially registered." Vega sketched a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A Spaniard, I was told. She must be very lost to have accepted joining a man with your history." "My wife knows what she needs to know," Matteo replied, deliberately emphasizing the word wife. "The rest is none of your business, Vega." The other man studied the half-built cabin with disdain. "You know this doesn't change anything, right?" he finally said. "La Mesa Verde should have been mine since your father failed. It's just a matter of time." "Time has already decided," Matteo responded, "and it has decided in my favor." Vega leaned slightly on his saddle, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "I wonder if your new wife knows the story of the original cabin," he said maliciously. "The one that burned one night with your entire family inside. How strange that only you survived unharmed, don't you think?" Matteo took a step forward, his hand instinctively moving to his side where years ago he would have carried a revolver. "Be careful what you insinuate, Vega," he warned, and there was something in his voice that made the other man back up slightly. "My family barely escaped that fire with their lives, and we both know who started it." Vega regained his smile, although his eyes remained cold. "I only know that rumors are persistent, Salazar, and your new wife might find them disturbing." With those words, Vega pulled on the reins and rode away at a gallop, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the poison of his insinuations floating in the air. Matteo remained motionless, feeling that the past was closing in on him like a trap. The half-built cabin now seemed like a monument to the fragility of his hopes. What would Elena think if she heard the rumors? Would she believe, like so many others, that he had something to do with the fire that almost ended his family? With mechanical movements, he extracted from his saddlebag the tools he had brought. Hammer, nails, a small saw, physica. Work had always been his refuge against dark thoughts. As he hammered wood and adjusted beams, his mind returned again and again to the woman who now bore his surname, Elena Navarro, now Salazar, was an enigma. There was something in her green eyes that spoke of deep losses, of wounds that time had not completely healed. She had married him, a stranger with a questionable reputation, without barely hesitating. What desperation, what courage, or what madness had driven her? When the sun began to set, Matteo contemplated his day's work. He had advanced less than planned, distracted by thoughts he couldn't silence. He mounted again and set off back to the ranch, aware that something had changed. He was no longer a solitary man fighting against the world. Now he had someone who depended on him, someone whose safety and well-being he had to consider. And for the first time in years, that responsibility didn't feel like a burden, but like a possibility of redemption. Days transformed into a routine that Elena didn't know she needed. She woke with the first rays of sun, prepared breakfast for Matteo before he went out to supervise work on the ranch, and then dedicated herself to organizing a house that had been inhabited only by men for too long. Her hands, which once turned pages of books and touched the keys of a piano, now learned the language of domestic work. Doña Carmen, a Mexican woman of advanced years who came daily to cook lunch for the workers, became her silent guide. Without asking about the strange marriage that everyone commented on in whispers, she taught her how to make tortillas, to recognize the herbs of the desert, to stretch scarce resources with ancestral ingenuity. "The desert gives you what you need if you know where to look," she told her one afternoon, while showing her how mesquite pods could be ground to make flour. "It's like life, child. It seems there's nothing, but abundance is hidden." Elena treasured those words, finding in them a reflection of her own situation. What had begun as a desperate agreement was transforming into something she couldn't name. It wasn't love, certainly not yet, but there was a growing comfort in the other's presence, a shared rhythm that settled between them like a barely audible melody. One morning, while cleaning Matteo's office, she found a locked drawer in the desk. The key he had given her, that ancient key she always carried with her like a talisman, fit into the lock. Inside there was a package of letters tied with a faded ribbon and a silver medallion with the image of a woman. Elena quickly closed the drawer, feeling she had violated an intimacy that didn't belong to her. But the image remained etched in her mind. Who was that woman? A previous wife, a lost love. That afternoon, when Matteo returned covered in dust and with fatigue drawn in the lines of his face, Elena felt the impulse to ask him. But the words died on her lips when she saw the shadow that crossed his gaze. "Tomorrow I'll go to La Mesa Verde," he announced, as they dined in a silence that had already become comfortable between them. "I need to continue with the construction of the cabin." Elena nodded, feeling a pang of curiosity about that place that seemed to have so much meaning for her husband. In the scarce conversations they had maintained, La Mesa Verde appeared as an almost mythological place, a green paradise in the midst of the relentless desert. "I'd like to go with you," she said, surprising herself with the initiative. "If you don't mind." Matteo looked up from his plate, surprise evident in his dark eyes. "It's a long journey, and the work there is hard," he replied after a moment. "There are no comforts." "I'm not looking for comforts," she replied with a softness that hid her determination, "and I can be more useful than you think." Something changed in Matteo's expression, an almost imperceptible softening around the eyes. "All right," he finally conceded, "we'll leave at dawn." The next morning found them riding side by side toward the horizon. Elena, who had learned to ride, in the last few weeks with the patient help of Tomas, felt increasingly comfortable on the chestnut mare that Matteo had chosen for her. The silence between them was not heavy but expectant, as if both sensed that something important awaited at the end of the road. When they finally reached La Mesa Verde, Elena understood Matteo's obsession. The elevated plain seemed like a miracle. Green and abundant grass, a small stream that wound among rocks, trees that offered generous shade. It was like a separate world, an oasis suspended above the desert. The half-built cabin stood at the southern end, overlooking the valley. The walls were raised halfway, the roof beams partially placed. Elena dismounted and approached, running, her hand over the rough wood. "It's beautiful," she said, and the emotion in her voice was genuine. I understand why it's so important to you. Matteo observed her with an indecipherable expression. My father dreamed of this place, he finally responded. He said that here we could be truly free, that no one would look at us as strangers in our own land. Elena nodded, recognizing in those words an echo of her own experience as a foreigner in a country that didn't fully accept her. Without waiting for instructions, she rolled up the sleeves of the simple dress she had chosen for the occasion and approached the tools Matteo had brought. Where do we start? She asked with a challenging smile. The surprise on Matteo's face gave way to something akin to respect. Without comment, he showed her how to correctly hold the hammer, how to measure and cut the wood, how to work alongside him in a rhythm that soon became natural. Under the Arizona sun, with hands toughened by work and sweat, drawing paths in the dust on their faces, Elena felt something new blooming inside her. It wasn't just the satisfaction of physical work, but the sensation of building something of her own, something that, like the green land that surrounded them, promised a future that for the first time in a long time she dared to imagine. The town of Valle Sereno bustled with unusual activity when Elena and Matteo arrived that Saturday. The small plaza in front of the church had been transformed into an improvised market where local vendors offered their products, vegetables grown in family gardens, leather and metal crafts, homemade sweets that perfumed the air. It was the first time Elena had visited the town since her hastily celebrated wedding. Curious glances followed her as she walked alongside Matteo, some openly hostile, others simply intrigued. The outsider's wife, the foreigner who had married the man about whom so many rumors weighed. Don't pay attention to them, Matteo murmured, perceiving her discomfort. They talk because they have nothing better to do. Elena nodded, straightening her back. She had put on her best dress for the occasion, one she had carefully mended, and wore her hair gathered in a simple but elegant bun. She wouldn't be ashamed, she promised herself, not before those gazes that judged her without knowing her. They separated briefly, Matteo to buy supplies for the ranch, Elena to look for fabrics and threads she desperately needed. The general store was a large, somber space, filled with shelves that contained everything from agricultural tools to patent medicines. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, attended to her with a courteous coldness that Elena was beginning to accept as normal. While examining the spools of thread, she heard fragments of conversation behind her. Two women, pretending to examine canned goods, whispered loudly enough to be heard. They say she's Spanish. From a good family, according to her. Although, who knows? A decent woman wouldn't marry a man like Salazar, not after what he did. Elena clutched the spools in her hand, feeling anger rising in her throat. She wanted to turn around, confront them, demand that they openly say what they were insinuating. But before she could do so, another voice joined the conversation. If you're going to talk about the Salazars, do it to their face. The voice belonged to an older woman, with grey hair and an erect posture despite her age. The whisperers fell silent, suddenly absorbed in their purchases. The woman approached Elena with a smile that transformed her severe face. I'm Isabel Mendoza, she introduced herself, extending a hand hardened by work. I knew Luis, Matteo's father. Good people, the Salazars, despite what these ill-omened crows say. Elena shook her hand, feeling unexpected relief at this gesture of kindness. Elena Navarro, in Salazar, she responded, the last name still strange on her lips. Isabel nodded, as if approving something only she could see. Come with me, she said, taking her arm with naturalness. I have something that might interest you. Isabel's house was a few streets from the store, a modest but impeccably maintained construction. In the small backyard, dozens of pots housed plants of all sizes, aromatic herbs, flowering cacti, small shrubs that Elena didn't recognize. My garden, Isabel explained proudly. The desert gives life if you know how to ask for it. Inside, the house was a testimony to a long and well-lived life. Carefully preserved antique furniture, photographs in silver frames, a collection of books that would have been impressive even in Madrid. Isabel led her to a small room and disappeared briefly before returning with a carved wooden box. Luis Salazar entrusted this to me before he died, she said, opening the box. He said I should keep it until Matteo was ready to receive it. I think that time has come. Inside the box was a book bound in dark leather and a package of letters similar to those Elena had seen in the desk drawer. On top of them rested a medallion identical to the one she had found, but this one bore the image of a man with dark eyes and a serious expression. These are Luis's diaries and the letters he exchanged with Mercedes, Matteo's mother, Isabel explained. And the medallions they gave each other when they got engaged. It was a tradition in their family. Elena touched the medallion with reverence, now understanding the meaning of the one she had found in the drawer. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, confused by the trust this woman seemed to place in her. Isabel looked at her intensely, as if evaluating something invisible to others. "Because I see in your eyes the same thing I saw in Mercedes's, when she arrived from Mexico alone and frightened, but with more strength than she herself knew she had," she responded. "And because Matteo needs to remember that he comes from a lineage of love, not just tragedy." Elena felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she didn't know she carried. "What happened to them?" she asked softly. "To Matteo's parents." Isabel sighed, and her gaze was lost in some point in the past. "The fire," she finally said. "The cabin in La Mesa Verde. Mercedes died there, along with Matteo's little sister. Luis survived just long enough to bring Matteo to Valle Sereno. The injuries were too severe." Elena's heart constricted. The whispers, the looks, Matteo's iron determination, everything acquired a new meaning in the light of this revelation. "Some in town," Isabel continued with bitterness, "suggested that Matteo had started the fire. A 15-year-old boy who lost his entire family in one night. Evil can be infinite when fed by ignorance. And Ernesto Vega?" Elena asked, remembering the name that Matteo had mentioned occasionally, always with obvious tension in his voice. Isabel's eyes hardened. "Vega always coveted La Mesa Verde. He offered to buy it from Luis for a pittance, and when he refused..." She left the sentence hanging in the air, but her meaning was clear. Nothing could be proven, of course, but all of us who knew Luis knew the truth. Isabel closed the box and put it in Elena's hands. "Give this to Matteo," she said. "Tell him it's time for the past to stop being a burden and become a foundation." When Elena and Matteo returned to the ranch that afternoon, the sun was beginning to descend, bathing the landscape in golden and reddish tones. The wooden box rested in Elena's lap, heavy with the stories it contained. That night, after dinner, Elena placed it on the table in front of Matteo. His eyes widened in recognition, and a shadow crossed his face. "Isabel Mendoza gave it to me," Elena explained softly. "She said it was time." Matteo remained motionless, as if the box were something dangerous that might explode at his touch. "I don't want to talk about this," he finally said, rising from the table. "I'm not asking you to talk," Elena responded, and her voice had a new firmness. "Just to remember who you are, where you come from." He stopped in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the dim light of the hallway. "I know exactly who I am, Elena," he said, and there was a deep bitterness in his voice. "I'm the son who couldn't save his family, the man people look at with suspicion, the stranger in his own land. You are more than that," she insisted, rising as well. "You are the son of Luis and Mercedes Salazar. You are the man who builds instead of destroying, the one who keeps his word and his honor in a world that seems to have forgotten the meaning of both." Matteo turned slowly, and Elena saw something break in his eyes, a crack in the armor he had built around his heart. "How can you be so sure?" he asked, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that he had never before revealed. "You barely know me." Elena took a step toward him, reducing the physical distance between them that somehow seemed to symbolize everything unsaid, everything that still separated them. "I know you enough," she responded, and the words emerged directly from a place inside her that she didn't know existed. "And I choose to believe in the man I see, not in the ghosts that haunt you." In the silence that followed, something changed between them. There was no physical contact, no grandiose declarations, just a sustained look that contained a mutual recognition. They were no longer simply two strangers united by a convenience agreement. They were two broken human beings who perhaps could help each other heal. Autumn settled in the territory with its palette of ochres and golds, transforming the landscape into a canvas that changed shades with each hour of the day. At the lone Eagle Ranch, preparations for winter advanced with the silent urgency of those who know that survival depends on foresight. Elena had fully integrated into the routine of the ranch. She was no longer the stranger who had arrived desperate, but a fundamental presence whose absence would be immediately noticed. The workers greeted her with respect. Doña Carmen confided culinary secrets to her that she had not shared with anyone, and Tomás solicited her opinion on ranch matters that he would previously have consulted only with Mateo. The deepest change, however, had occurred between her and her husband. Since that night with the box of memories, a new intimacy had developed between them. It wasn't physical. Mateo continued to scrupulously respect the boundaries established in their agreement, but emotional, a tacit understanding that manifested in small gestures: a cup of coffee prepared exactly as he liked it, a book left open on a page she might enjoy, conversations that extended until dawn on topics ranging from philosophy to childhood memories. One afternoon, while Eleanor classified seeds for the garden she had begun next to the house, Mateo appeared in the kitchen doorway. He wore clean clothes and had trimmed his beard, a detail she noticed with an inexplicable warmth in her chest. "Come with me," he said, extending a hand in a gesture that seemed as natural as breathing. "I want to show you something." The sun was beginning its descent when they reached a low hill half an hour's ride from the ranch. From there, the view encompassed kilometers of territory. The lands of the Lone Eagle with their golden pastures, the beginning of the mountains in the distance, and to the north, the intense green of La Mesa Verde that stood out like an island in the arid ocean. Mateo dismounted and helped Elena do the same, his firm hands on her waist causing a tingling that she attributed to the fatigue of the journey. From his saddlebag, he extracted a blanket that he spread over the dry grass and a small package wrapped in cloth. "My mother used to bring me here," he explained as they sat down. "She said it was the perfect place to understand our place in the world, high enough to see far, but not so much as to forget that we belong to the earth." Elena observed the landscape with new eyes, imagining a young Mateo absorbing the wisdom of a mother that fate would take from him too soon. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you for sharing it with me." Mateo unwrapped the package, revealing freshly baked bread, cheese, dried fruits, and a small bottle of wine. A simple but carefully prepared meal, a gesture that contained more meaning than any word. "I've been reading my father's diaries," he confessed as they shared the food. "And the letters." Elena held her breath, aware of how significant this moment was. Since that night, the box had remained on Mateo's desk, but they had never mentioned it again. "And what have you found?" she asked delicately. Mateo contemplated the horizon, where the sun was beginning to merge with the earth in a spectacle of light that seemed created exclusively for them. "My parents," he finally responded, "not as I remembered them, frozen in the moment of their loss, but as real people. My father wrote poetry, you know, in secret, only for my mother, and she kept seeds of flowers from her native village, waiting for the day when she could plant them in her own land." His voice broke slightly, and Elena resisted the impulse to take his hand, giving him the space he needed to continue. "I had forgotten so many things," he continued, "or perhaps I never really knew them. I was so focused on keeping their material legacy alive, the land, the ranch, that I forgot the most important thing: how they lived, how they loved each other, what they dreamed for us." Elena thought of her own parents, of the library in Madrid, where her father had taught her to love books, of her mother's soft hands guiding hers over the piano keys. The memories she had kept locked away because they hurt too much. "Grief does that to us," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We focus on the loss because facing happy memories hurts more." Mateo looked at her then, really looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "How did you come here, Elena?" he asked. "I've never really asked you what brought you to Arizona so far from Spain." The question, so simple and yet so profound, Enid gates that Elena had kept closed for years. She told him about her father's library in Madrid, about the books that had been her refuge, about the ruin that followed his death, about the promise of a cousin in America that turned out to be as illusory as a mirage in the desert. About the 3 years wandering from city to city, surviving on occasional jobs, clinging to her dignity as her only treasure. Sometimes I think it was all a path to get here, she concluded, surprised by her own sincerity. That each loss, each disappointment was guiding me toward something I couldn't imagine. Matteo nodded, understanding without the need for more words. In a gesture that seemed as natural as inevitable, he took her hand. The contact, simple and chaste, contained more intimacy than any passionate embrace. "I have something for you," he said, releasing her hand to search for something in his jacket pocket. It was a small leather bag, the kind that natives of the region used to keep sacred objects. Matteo offered it to her with an expression that mixed nervousness and determination. "Open it," he encouraged her. Inside she found a silver medallion, identical to those she had seen in the box of memories, but this one was new, freshly forged, and instead of a face, it contained a small painting of La Mesa Verde, with its half-built cabin and winding stream. "I commissioned it from the silversmith in Valle Sereno," Matteo explained. "My father gave one to my mother when they decided to build a life together, not as a promise of eternal love, but as a symbol of a shared future, whatever it might be." Elena held the medallion, feeling its weight in the palm of her hand, the metal still warm from Matteo's body. "It's beautiful," she murmured, moved by the meaning of the gift. "I don't know what will become of us, Elena," he continued. And there was a vulnerability in his voice that deeply moved her. "Our beginning wasn't conventional, and the future is always uncertain. But I want you to know that for me, you are no longer a solution to a legal problem. You are," he searched for the right word, "someone with whom I want to build something, whatever it may be." Elena didn't respond with words. In a gesture that surprised them both, she leaned in and softly kissed Matteo's cheek near the corner of his lips. A chaste kiss that contained unspoken promises. "Help me put it on," she asked, offering him the medallion and turning her back so he could place it around her neck. Matteo's fingers brushed her nape as he secured the clasp, sending shivers down her spine. When she turned to him, the medallion rested over her heart, shining with the last rays of the setting sun. They exchanged no more words as they gathered the remains of their meal and mounted again. None were necessary. Something fundamental had changed between them, a mutual recognition that what had begun as a contract was transforming into something much deeper, truer. As they rode back to the ranch, side by side, Eleanor thought about the seeds she had been classifying that morning. Some needed specific conditions to germinate, a period of cold, a fire, the erosion of their hard shell. Perhaps human hearts were not so different. Perhaps they needed to go through winter, fire, or erosion to finally open themselves to new possibilities. And perhaps, she thought, as her hand touched the medallion she now wore, she and Matteo were finally ready to bloom. Winter arrived with a ferocity that took even the oldest inhabitants of the territory by surprise. The sky, usually of an almost painful blue, was covered with low, heavy clouds that discharged torrential rains for days. The normally tame streams became furious torrents, and the roads turned into rivers of mud that made transit almost impossible. At the Lone Eagle Ranch, activity retreated indoors. The workers concentrated on repairing harnesses, sharpening tools, and performing all those tasks that had been postponed during the months of intensive work. Doña Carmen prepared comforting stews that filled the house with aromas of cumin and chile, and Tomás spent long hours with Matteo, planning the next season. Elena had discovered a new passion in the ranch's accounting books. With the meticulousness that characterized her, she reorganized the entire financial system, discovering expense patterns that could be optimized and opportunities that Matteo hadn't considered. Each night by the fire, they shared their findings and discussed possibilities, gradually forming a shared vision of the ranch's future. It was during one of these conversations that Elena mentioned an idea that had been maturing for weeks. "I've been thinking about the Valle Sereno library," she said, as they reviewed the numbers from the last cattle sale. "Or rather, the lack of it." Matteo looked up from the papers, intrigued. "The town has never had one," he responded. "The school has some books, but they are few and old." Exactly, she continued, and her eyes shone with enthusiasm. I've been talking with the teacher, Miss Thompson. She says that many children, especially those from Mexican families, abandon school because they don't see the purpose of learning. To read in a place where there's nothing to read. Elena stood and began to walk around the room, a habit that Mateo had learned to associate with her mind working at full speed. My father believed that books are doors, she continued. Doors to worlds that we would otherwise never know. Doors to possibilities that we couldn't even imagine. Those children deserve to have those doors open for them. Mateo observed her with a mixture of admiration and something deeper that he still didn't dare to name. What do you propose? He asked, although he already intuited the answer. I want to donate part of our profits to establish a small library in Valle Sereno, she responded, stopping in front of him. Start with the basics. Books in English and Spanish, an adequate space, someone to manage it. We could collaborate with the school. Mateo considered the proposal. It wasn't a large amount of money, but it wasn't insignificant for a ranch that was just beginning to be truly profitable. It's your money too, he finally said. If it's what you want to do, go ahead. Elena's smile lit up her face in a way that made Mateo's heart accelerate. Thank you, she said simply, but the word contained much more than gratitude for his approval. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent knock on the door. Tomas entered without waiting for a response, water dripping from his poncho and hat. Boss, the creek has overflowed, he reported, his voice tense with concern. The water is rising toward the eastern corrals. If it keeps raining like this, we could lose the stables. Mateo stood immediately. Gather as many men as you can, he ordered, already heading for the door. We'll need sandbags and all available hands. Elena followed them to the porch. The night was a curtain of water falling violently, occasionally illuminated by lightning that revealed a landscape transformed by the flood. She could make out the silhouettes of the workers running toward the stables, fighting against the wind and rain. Stay here, Mateo told her, adjusting his raincoat. We'll be fine. But Elena was already putting a cape over her shoulders. You'll need all the help possible, she responded with determination. I can fill sacks like anyone else. Mateo looked at her as if he wanted to protest, but finally nodded. He understood that determination, respected it. The following hours were a blur of desperate effort against the elements. Elena, soaked to the bone, worked alongside the workers filling sacks that were then strategically placed to divert the water. Her hands, once soft, were now reddened and cracked from the cold and effort, but she didn't allow herself to rest. This was her home now, her responsibility as much as Mateo's. Near dawn, when the rain finally began to ease, Elena found herself working side by side with Mateo, both placing the last sacks to protect the main barn. They were exhausted, covered in mud, but united by a common purpose that seemed more significant than any ceremony or legal document. I never thought I'd see Mrs. Salazar like this, commented one of the younger workers to Tomas, without realizing that Elena could hear him. Working like one of us without complaining. Mrs. Salazar is stronger than she looks, Tomas responded, with evident respect in his voice. She has the heart of a true rancher. The words warmed Elena more than any fire could have. Not for the approval itself, but because they reflected a truth that she herself was beginning to recognize. This place, these people, this life she had accepted out of desperation, had become an integral part of who she was now. When they finally returned to the house, the sun was beginning to peek through the clouds, illuminating a transformed, but not defeated, landscape. Mateo lit the fire while Elena prepared coffee, moving in synchrony as if they had been sharing these daily rhythms for years. You should change those wet clothes, he said, noticing how she trembled slightly. You too, Elena responded, passing him a steaming cup. But first this. They sat in front of the fire, too exhausted to move, too alert to sleep. The silence between them was comfortable, full of mutual understanding and a respect that had blossomed during those hours of working together. I thought we were going to lose everything, Mateo confessed after a long silence. The ranch, the animals, everything I've built over these years. Elena studied his profile, the firm line of his jaw, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worries. You didn't lose it, she responded softly, and you weren't alone. Matteo turned to her, and in his eyes there was an emotion that made Elena's heart skip a beat. No, I wasn't alone, he repeated, and the words seemed to contain multiple meanings. Thanks to you. With a movement that seemed both impulsive and long considered, Matteo extended his hand and caressed Elena's cheek, brushing away a damp strand of hair from her face. The contact, brief and gentle, sent a current of warmth throughout her body. We should rest, said Elena, although she made no movement to get up. It's been a long night. Matteo nodded, but he didn't move either. His eyes didn't leave hers, as if he were looking for answers to questions he still didn't dare to formulate. Elena, he began, his voice rough from fatigue and something more. When you accepted my proposal, I promised you that you would have the freedom to leave whenever you wanted. That promise still stands. She felt a knot in her throat. Was he asking her to leave? Had she misinterpreted all the signs of the last few months? Do you want me to go? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. No, he responded immediately, and the intensity of that single word dispelled her fears. I don't want you to leave ever, but I need you to know that if you stay, if you decide to stay, I want it to be because you desire it, not because you feel obligated by an agreement or by gratitude. Elena set her cup on the table and, in an act of courage that surprised them both, took Matteo's hands in hers. They were rough, marked by years of hard work, but they felt perfect against her skin. I'm staying because I want to build this with you, she said, and the words emerged directly from her heart. The ranch, the library, the cabin in La Mesa Verde, a life. Not out of obligation, not out of gratitude, but because I can't imagine being anywhere else now. Matteo's smile began slowly, like a sunrise transforming his tired face. Without words, he leaned toward her. This time it wasn't a kiss on the cheek, but a soft, almost reverent contact of lips against lips. A first kiss that contained both, a question and a promise. When they separated, the world seemed to have subtly changed, like the landscape after the storm. Washed, renewed, full of possibilities that didn't exist before. We should really rest now, said Matteo, although his eyes remained fixed on Elena's lips. She nodded, rising slowly. At the threshold that separated the living room from the bedrooms, she stopped and turned to him. Good night, Matteo, she said, and his name on her lips sounded like a caress. Good night, Elena, he responded, and in his voice there was a promise of many shared dawns to come. Spring arrived in the territory with an exuberance that seemed to want to compensate for winter's fury. The slopes surrounding the ranch were covered with wildflowers, purple verbenas, golden poppies, blue lupines, creating a spectacle that changed with each breeze. The streams, still swollen from the mountain snowmelt, sang among the rocks with crystalline voices. At the Lone Eagle Ranch, life had found a new rhythm. The repairs after the floods had united all its inhabitants even more, creating a sense of community that went beyond the simple relationship between boss and workers. Elena had proven her worth not only as manager of the house, but as an integral part of the ranch's operation, earning the respect that no title or surname could have achieved. Her relationship with Matteo had evolved with the same naturalness with which the seasons changed. The first kiss by the fire had been followed by others, each one deeper, more meaningful than the last. Shared dinners stretched into the early morning with conversations that intertwined the past and the future. And when finally Matteo had asked, with a shyness that contradicted his usual confidence, if Elena would consider sharing his room, she had responded by taking his hand and guiding him there herself. Now, as she supervised the planting of the garden she had designed next to the house, Elena reflected on the improbability of her situation. A year ago, she wandered aimlessly, clinging to the crumbs of dignity she had left. Today she was the Lady of the Lone Eagle, not only in name, but in essence respected by the workers, loved by Doña Carmen, and loved, yes, loved, though the word had not yet been pronounced, by a man who had entered her life as a contract and had become her companion. The library project was advancing with firm steps. The small room annexed to the school had been conditioned, and the first books, some donated by families in the town, others bought with the funds that Eleanor had allocated, already occupied shelves made by the local carpenter. The opening was scheduled for the following Sunday, coinciding with the town's spring celebration. Those seeds aren't going to plant themselves, you know? Matteo's voice pulled her from her reflections. He was leaning on the garden fence, observing her with a smile he reserved only for her, a mixture of tenderness and admiration that still made her blush. "I was thinking," Elena responded, approaching him, "about how things change in a year." Matteo extended his hand over the fence, and she took it naturally. These small contacts, once so extraordinary, now formed part of their shared language. "For the better, I hope," he said, his eyes seeking confirmation in hers. "Definitely for the better," Elena assured, gently squeezing his hand. They were about to continue the conversation when they saw Tomas approaching on horseback at a pace that indicated urgent news. His expression, visible even at a distance, confirmed their suspicions. "Boss, ma'am," he greeted, quickly dismounting. "I have news from Valle Sereno. They've seen Vega and his men heading toward La Mesa Verde. They were carrying tools and wood." Matteo's face darkened. "Are you sure?" he asked, although the tension in his voice revealed that he had already accepted the information as true. "Pedro saw it when returning from town," Tomas confirmed. "He says they seemed to be in a hurry, as if they wanted to do something before being discovered." Matteo released Elena's hand and took a step toward the stables. "Prepare my horse," he ordered, "and tell Juan and Miguel to come armed. I will not allow Vega to invade my property." Elena felt fear coiling in her stomach, like a cold snake. "I'll go with you," she said with a firmness that surprised both men. "It's too dangerous," Matteo responded, turning to her. "Vega is a man without scruples, and I don't know what he might be planning." Elena moved closer to him, speaking in a low voice, so only he could hear her. "La Mesa Verde is as much mine as yours now," she reminded him. "Our names are together on the deed. If it needs to be defended, we'll do it together." Matteo studied her face, looking for signs of doubt or fear. He found only determination. "All right," he finally conceded, "but you'll stay back if there's trouble." The journey to La Mesa Verde was made in tense silence. Matteo rode at the front, flanked by Juan and Miguel, two of the most reliable workers on the ranch. Elena and Tomas closed the group. As they approached, the smoke visible in the distance confirmed their worst fears. "They're burning something," exclaimed Juan, pointing to the grey column rising against the clear sky. Matteo spurred his horse, advancing ahead of the group. Elena followed him, ignoring her promise to stay back in case of danger. When they finally reached the summit that overlooked La Mesa Verde, the scene they found froze the blood in their veins. The cabin, the one they had built together over months, stone by stone, beam by beam, was engulfed in flames. Ernesto Vega and 3 of his men observed the fire from a safe distance, with the satisfaction of those who have executed a long-meditated plan. Vega. Matteo's shout echoed in the valley, making the men turn, surprised by their arrival. Vega quickly recovered from the surprise, and a cruel smile formed on his face. "Salazar," he greeted with false cordiality. "What an unfortunate accident, isn't it? History tends to repeat itself on this property." Matteo dismounted in a jump, and Elena could see the barely contained fury in every line of his body. Juan and Miguel positioned themselves strategically, their hands near the weapons they carried. "This is not an accident," Matteo responded, advancing toward Vega. "It's arson on my property." Vega made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "Your property. That remains to be seen. My lawyers have found irregularities in your claim. It seems that the marriage that supports it might not be legitimate." Elena, who had dismounted and approached Matteo, felt the world wobbling beneath her feet. How could Vega know about the circumstances of their marriage? "Our marriage is perfectly legal," she intervened, her voice firmer than she felt. "The documents are in order." Vega looked at her with a mixture of surprise and disdain, as if only now noticing her presence. "Ah, Mrs. Salazar," he said, making a mocking bow. "Or should I say, Miss Navarro? Does your husband know about the cousin who brought you to America? Or about how that cousin turned out not to be a relative at all, but a man with whom you had fled from Spain?" The blow was so unexpected that Elena stepped back as if she had been physically slapped. How could Vega know details of her past that not even Matteo knew? Elena, Matteo's voice sounded distant, confused. What is he talking about? But before she could respond, Vega continued, clearly enjoying the damage he was causing. Marriage based on lies is not valid before the law, he declared. And without a valid marriage, your claim on La Mesa Verde crumbles. My lawyers will present a challenge next week. The cabin burned before them, the flames devouring months of work and hopes. But it was the invisible fire between her and Matteo that Elena feared more. It doesn't matter what he says, Tomas intervened, who had approached to support his boss. Burning someone else's property is a crime. The sheriff will hear about this. Vega let out a derisive laugh. What property? This is nothing but a pile of wood on land that will soon be mine, and nobody can prove who started the fire. Vega's men had adopted defensive postures, their hands near their weapons. The tension was palpable, like the charged air before an electrical storm. Let's go, Vega ordered his men, mounting again. Our work here is done. I suggest you enjoy La Mesa Verde while you can, Salazar. Your days here are numbered. As Vega and his men rode away, Elena turned to Matteo, anxious to explain herself, to deny Vega's insinuations. But the expression on her husband's face stopped her. It wasn't anger she saw, but something worse. Doubt, confusion, the ghost of betrayal peeking between them. Matteo, she began, but he had already moved away, heading toward the burning cabin. Juan Miguel, he called. Help me put out this fire before it spreads. During the following hours, they worked in silence to control the fire. The cabin was lost, but they managed to prevent the flames from spreading through the dry grass of La Mesa Verde. When finally the fire was reduced to smoking embers, the sun was beginning to set, bathing the devastated landscape in a golden light that seemed a cruel irony. Elena approached Matteo, who contemplated the charred ruins with an indecipherable expression. We need to talk, she said softly. About what Vega said. Matteo nodded without looking at her, his eyes fixed on the remains of what they had built together. Let's return to the ranch, he finally responded. It's been a long day. The return journey was a study in silence. Elena felt that every meter they advanced opened a deeper abyss between them, a space filled with unasked questions and half-told truths. When they finally reached the ranch, night had completely fallen. Matteo gave instructions to the workers for the next day and entered the house without waiting for her. Elena followed him, her heart beating painfully against her ribs. She found him in his office, pouring himself a glass of whiskey with mechanical movements. Without offering her one, he sat behind the desk, creating a physical barrier between them that reflected the emotional one. Is it true? He finally asked, his voice controlled but with an underlying tremor. What Vega said about your cousin? Elena breathed deeply, seeking the courage to face a past she had hoped to leave behind. Partially, she admitted. Miguel wasn't my cousin, but the son of a friend of my father's. When my father died and we lost everything, he offered to bring me to America. He promised me marriage and a new life. Matteo took a long drink, as if he needed the burn of the alcohol to endure what he was hearing. And what happened? He asked, although his eyes suggested he already anticipated the answer. What usually happens with promises too beautiful, Elena responded with bitterness. They were lies. When we arrived in New York, I discovered he was already married. He abandoned me without money, without contacts, in a strange country whose language I barely spoke. Tears threatened to overflow, but Elena refused to let them fall. She wouldn't cry for that past, not now, not when her present and her future were at stake. Why didn't you tell me? Matteo's voice no longer sounded accusatory but hurt, betrayed not by the facts but by the silence that had surrounded them. Because I was ashamed, Elena confessed, and the truth hurt to pronounce. Because I feared you would see in me a naive woman who allowed herself to be deceived, or worse, that you would think there was something improper between Miguel and me. And because when I finally found the courage to tell you, I already felt it was too late, that I should have done it before. Silence extended between them, heavy with truths that had remained hidden too long. I've made mistakes, Matteo, Elena finally continued. I've hidden parts of my past because I feared losing what we had built. But I have never lied to you about what I feel for you, for this place, for the life we have created together. Matteo rose and approached the window, turning his back to Elena. The moonlight outlined his silhouette against the outer darkness. I need time, he finally said, to think, to process all this. Elena nodded, though he couldn't see her. The knot in her throat threatened to choke her. I understand, she managed to articulate. I'll be in my room, the old one. Upon leaving the office, Elena felt she was leaving behind much more than a room. The last months of shared happiness, the silent promises, the barely sketched dreams. Everything seemed so fragile now, so vulnerable to the flames of the past as the cabin they had just lost. In the solitude of her old room, Elena touched the medallion she still wore around her neck. The small painting of La Mesa Verde, now a painful reminder of hopes in ashes. But as her fingers traced the contour of the metal, she remembered something Doña Carmen had once told her about the desert. There are seeds that only germinate after fire. They sleep under the ground for years, waiting for the flames to give them the signal that it's time to grow. Perhaps, she thought as tears finally found their way down her cheeks, perhaps human relationships were not so different. Perhaps some truths needed the fire of crisis to finally emerge, to create something new from the ashes of what had been lost. With that thought, she allowed herself to cry, not just for the lost day, but for all the years of solitude and fear, for the girl she had been and the woman she had become. She cried until she had no tears left, and then in the silence of the night she began to plan what she would do at dawn. Because if she had learned anything in her life, it was that even in the most burned land, the seeds of hope could find a place to take root. Elena woke before dawn after a night of restless sleep. For hours she had contemplated the shadows that the moonlight cast on the ceiling, mentally reviewing everything that had happened, seeking a path through the labyrinth of half-truths and prolonged silences that now threatened to separate her from Matteo. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but dignified dress. If she was going to face what was coming, she would do it with her head held high. Before leaving the room, she made a decision. She would not passively await Matteo's judgment. She would act, take the reins of her destiny as she had learned to do since she arrived in this harsh but honest land. The house was silent, barely illuminated by the first rays of sun filtering through the eastern windows. In the kitchen, she prepared coffee and served it in 2 cups. Then, breathing deeply to gather courage, she headed for Matteo's office. She found him asleep in the armchair, still dressed in the clothes from the previous day. The empty whiskey glass on the desk and the scattered papers spoke of a night as restless as hers. Gently, she placed one of the cups near his hand and took a step back, waiting. The aroma of coffee woke him. Matteo opened his eyes slowly, disoriented for a moment until his gaze fell on Elena. Recognition, followed by the memory of the previous day's events, transformed his expression. "Good morning," she said, standing firm before the coldness she perceived in his eyes. "I thought you would need this." Matteo sat up, running a hand over his tired face. "Thank you," he responded, taking the cup but not drinking. Silence extended between them, uncomfortable and heavy as it had never been before. Elena felt the carefully rehearsed words during the night evaporating in the face of the reality of his distant gaze. "I'm going to Valle Sereno today," she finally announced. "I need to talk with Judge Fuentes." Matteo looked at her with surprise. "Why?" he asked, and there was a note of alarm in his voice. Elena held his gaze, determined not to show the fear she felt. "Because Vega is questioning the validity of our marriage based on information about my past," she responded. "I need to know if it has any legal foundation, if it can really threaten your claim on La Mesa Verde." Matteo set the cup on the desk with a harder blow than necessary. "My claim," he repeated. "I thought we had established that it's our claim." "That depends on whether you still consider our marriage valid," Elena responded, and she couldn't prevent a tremor from slipping into her voice. "After what you've discovered." Matteo stood and walked to the window, turning his back to her. The morning light outlined his silhouette in golden tones, softening the hard angles of his tense shoulders. "I don't know what to think, Elena," he finally confessed. And there was a vulnerability in his voice that she had rarely heard. It's not that I care that he wasn't your cousin or whatever happened before we met. It's that you kept that hidden even when we became—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Close." Elena took a step toward him, though she maintained a certain distance, respecting the space he seemed to need. "I know," she admitted, "and I'm sorry. I should have told you a long time ago. But I was afraid, Matteo, afraid of losing what we had built, of you seeing me differently." "How do you think I feel now?" he asked, finally turning to look at her. "Knowing that Vega knows parts of your life that I didn't? What else don't I know?" "Helena." The question floated in the air between them, loaded with implications. Helena then understood that trust, that fragile and precious element they had carefully cultivated for months, was in danger, and only the truth, complete and unadorned, would have any chance of restoring it. "Sit down," she asked, indicating the armchair. "I'll tell you everything from the beginning." During the next hour, Elena spoke as she had never done before. She told him about her privileged childhood in Madrid, about her father's library where she had learned to love books and ideas. She told him about the illness that slowly consumed her mother, about the debts her father accumulated trying to save her, about how, after his death, they discovered that nothing was left. She told him about Miguel Alvarado, the son of her father's best friend, who appeared with promises of marriage and a new life in America, about how, desperate and without other options, she had accepted, convincing herself that affection would grow with time, about the voyage by ship, the arrival in New York, the devastating discovery that Miguel was already married and had only used her to escape his own problems in Spain. She told him about the 3 years wandering from city to city, working as a governess, seamstress, whatever was necessary to survive, about how she had learned English by listening to conversations and reading discarded newspapers, about how, finally, she had heard about the West, where a woman willing to work hard could find a place where the past mattered less than the will to build a future. "And then I found you," she concluded, her voice hoarse after speaking for so long. "Or you found me, with your absurd proposal that seemed like the last chance fate offered me." Matteo had listened in silence, his expression gradually changing, from initial coldness to something more complex, understanding, respect, and perhaps a hint of the warmth she so longed for. "Why does Vega know all this?" he finally asked. "How could he discover it?" Elena shook her head, equally confused by that detail. "I don't know," she admitted. "Perhaps he hired someone to investigate me when he learned we had married. Perhaps someone from my past recognized me and spoke. All I know is that he's using that information to try to invalidate our marriage and take La Mesa Verde." Matteo stood and began to walk around the room, his mind clearly working on the legal implications of the situation. "He can't do it," he finally said. "Our marriage is legal regardless of your past. The claim is in order." "Still, I want to talk to the judge," Elena insisted. "I want to be sure, and I want him to know the whole truth before Vega tries to distort it." Matteo stopped in front of her, studying her face as if looking for something specific in her features. "I'll go with you," he finally said. Elena felt something loosen in her chest, a tension that had been present since the confrontation with Vega. "Does that mean—" She left the question unfinished, fearful of assuming too much. Matteo took her, hands in his, a gesture that had been absent during the last painful hours. "It means we'll face this together," he responded. "As it should be." The journey to Valle Sereno was made in a silence different from that of the previous night. It wasn't the tense silence of unspoken words, but the reflective silence of those who process newly revealed truths. Occasionally their gazes met, and Elena could see that Matteo was still dealing with everything he had learned, but also that he was striving to understand, to rebuild what had been damaged. Judge Fuentes received them in his office with evident surprise. It wasn't common for the Salazar marriage to appear without prior notice, especially so early. "How can I help you?" he asked, indicating that they should take a seat. Elena exchanged a look with Matteo before beginning. With the same honesty with which she had spoken to him, she told the judge about her past, about Vega's insinuations, about her concern for the legal validity of her marriage. The judge listened attentively, his impassive expression revealing nothing of his thoughts, as Elena exposed every detail of her story. When she finally finished, a heavy silence settled in the room. The judge interlaced his fingers over the desk and observed them both for a long moment. "Mrs. Salazar," he finally said, "I thank you for your honesty. It's not easy to reveal such personal aspects of our life, especially those that cause us shame or pain." Elena nodded, feeling a weight lightening slightly from her shoulders. At her side, Matteo remained still, his presence a mixture of strength and vulnerability that she could feel without needing to look at him. Regarding Mr. Vega's insinuations, the judge continued, "I can assure you that they lack legal foundation. Your marriage was celebrated, fulfilling all the requirements of the law. What happened before you met has no legal relevance." Matteo leaned slightly forward. "Are you completely sure, Judge?" Vega mentioned lawyers and challenges. Judge Fuentes let out a sigh that spoke of years dealing with human ambitions and pettiness. "Ernesto Vega has been looking for ways to appropriate La Mesa Verde for years," he responded. "First he tried to buy it from your father for a pittance. Then he claimed irregularities in the boundaries. Then he questioned your family's nationality. He always looks for some legal loophole to get what he wants." He removed his glasses and meticulously cleaned them with a handkerchief, a gesture that seemed to help him order his thoughts. "What Vega doesn't understand," he continued, "is that the law, with all its imperfections, is designed to protect those who act in good faith. And you have done so, regardless of how your union began." Elena felt a solitary tear sliding down her cheek. She wiped it discreetly, but not before Matteo noticed it. With a gesture that surprised both of them by its naturalness, he took her hand and gently squeezed it. "What do you suggest we do, Judge?" Elena asked, her voice firmer than she felt. The judge reclined in his chair, studying them with a gaze that seemed to see beyond appearances. "In legal terms, nothing," he responded. "Your claim on La Mesa Verde is perfectly valid, but knowing Vega, he won't stop here. I suggest you be alert and document any suspicious action on his part, especially after the fire you've described to me." He stood, indicating that the meeting had concluded. "And if you'll allow me a personal piece of advice," he added, with an unusual softness in his normally pragmatic voice, "remember that the strongest foundations are not those built on perfect terrain, but those that adapt to the irregularities of the ground." Upon leaving the judge's office, Elena felt a contradictory mixture of relief and apprehension. The legal confirmation of her marriage eliminated one concern, but the threat of Vega remained present, like a dark cloud on the horizon of their lives. They walked in silence down the main street of Valle Sereno, each immersed in their own thoughts. The town was especially animated that day. Artisans installed stalls for the spring celebration, children ran between the legs of adults, and the aroma of freshly baked bread floated from the bakery. In front of the school, now also a library thanks to Elena's efforts, they stopped. The curtains she herself had sewn waved gently in the open windows. "The inauguration is this Sunday," she commented, seeking to break the silence that had settled between them. Matteo observed the building as if seeing it for the first time. "You've created something beautiful here," he finally said, "something that will remain long after we're gone." Elena felt her heart accelerate at the implication of his words, a shared future, a life together beyond the circumstances that had united them. "Matteo," she began, gathering courage for the question that burned inside her, "can you forgive that I hid the truth about my past from you?" He turned to her, and in his eyes Elena saw the reflection of her own vulnerability, of her own longing. "To be understood and accepted, there's nothing to forgive," he responded softly. "We all have parts of our history that hurt too much to share easily." He took a step toward her, reducing the physical distance between them that during the last hours had seemed insurmountable. "What hurt me was thinking that you didn't trust me enough to tell me," he continued. "That after everything we've lived through together, you still felt you needed to protect yourself from me." Elena felt that tears returned to her eyes, but this time she didn't try to hide them. "It was never a lack of trust in you," she explained. "It was fear of myself, of what you would think of me, that you would see in me the naive and desperate woman I was, not the person I've become at your side." Matteo raised a hand and with a tenderness that contrasted with his rugged appearance, wiped a tear from her cheek. "I see you, Elena," he said, and the words resonated between them like a promise. I see the woman who had the courage to accept a marriage with a stranger because it was her only option. I see the woman who transformed a house into a home, who earned the respect of everyone on the ranch, who works alongside me as if she had been born for this life. His hand remained on her cheek, a contact as light as it was significant, and I see the woman who, despite fear, finally found the courage to reveal all her truths, regardless of the risk. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting his words envelop her like a balm. When she opened them again, Matteo was still there, looking at her with an intensity that made everything else disappear. The town, the worries, even the threat of Vega. I love you, she said, the words emerging directly from her heart, without premeditation. Not as part of an agreement, not out of gratitude or convenience. I love you for who you are, for who I am when I'm with you. Matteo's smile began in his eyes, before extending to his lips. And I love you, he responded, and although it was the first time he pronounced those words, they sounded like a long-known truth. For the same reasons, and for 1,000 more that I discover each day. In the middle of the main street of Valle Sereno, surrounded by the bustle of festive preparations, they kissed. It wasn't a tentative kiss like the first ones they had shared, but one that contained all the revealed truths, all the fears faced, all the rebuilt trust. When they separated, something had changed between them. The shadows that Vega's revelations had cast had dissipated, not because the problems had disappeared, but because they had chosen to face them together in the light of a newly discovered honesty. Let's go home, said Matteo, offering her his arm. We have a cabin to rebuild and a ranch to protect. Eleanor intertwined her arm with his, feeling that the word home had never had such a deep and true meaning. The preparations for the spring celebration of Valle Sereno coincided with a new beginning at the Lone Eagle Ranch. After the visit to Judge Fuentes, Elena and Matteo had returned with a renewed determination, not only to protect what was theirs, but to strengthen it. The burned cabin in La Mesa Verde had become a symbol. Vega had tried to destroy what it represented, but as Doña Carmen had explained to Elena while they selected seeds for the garden, fire cleanses and prepares the ground for new, stronger growth. That Sunday morning, as they prepared to attend the inauguration of the library, Elena contemplated her reflection in the mirror. She had chosen her best dress, a dark blue one that she had carefully modified with lace, rescued from old garments. The medallion that Matteo had given her shone against the fabric, a constant reminder of shared promises. Matteo appeared behind her, reflected in the mirror. He had shaved completely, revealing a younger, almost vulnerable face. His suit, saved for special occasions, gave him a dignity that contrasted with his usual pragmatism. "You're beautiful," he said, his eyes finding hers in the reflection. Elena turned to him, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle in his lapel. "And you look like a respectable rancher," she responded with a smile. "No one would guess that just yesterday. You were covered in dirt up to your eyebrows, rebuilding fences." Matteo captured her hand and brought it to his lips, a gesture he had recently discovered, and that always caused a tingling in Elena's stomach. "We are many things at once, don't you think?" he said, with a lightness that hid the depth of the observation. "Ranchers and readers, builders and dreamers." Elena nodded, thinking about how the identities they had adopted out of necessity had transformed into something chosen, something of their own. "And today," she continued, adjusting the medallion, "we are benefactors of the town. Who would have imagined?" The journey to Valle Sereno was a display of the ranch's best finery. They had decorated the carriage with wildflowers, and Tomas accompanied them on horseback, dressed in his Sunday suit. It was important, Elena had insisted, that the inauguration of the library be a significant event, something that the town would remember and value. The town bustled with festive activity. The central plaza had been transformed into a colorful market where everything from food to local crafts was sold. Children in Sunday clothes ran between the stalls, and the music of guitars and violins floated in the warm morning air. In front of the school, now also a library, a small group had gathered. Miss Thompson, the young teacher, received the attendees with a nervous smile. Reverend Gibson, the town doctor, and some of the most prominent families of Valle Sereno formed an expectant semicircle. Elena noticed that Isabel Mendoza was among them, her grey hair gathered in an elegant bun, her eyes bright with approval upon seeing them arrive. At her side, to Elena's surprise, was Judge Fuentes, who usually avoided public festivities. What she didn't expect to see, however, was the tall, dark figure of Ernesto Vega, casually leaning against a nearby post, observing them with a smile. That didn't reach his eyes. Mateo saw him too. His body tensed imperceptibly, but his face remained serene. "Don't let him ruin this day," Elena murmured, gently squeezing his arm. "It's exactly what he's looking for." Mateo nodded slightly, and together they advanced toward the small group that awaited them. Miss Thompson stepped forward, her cheeks rosy with excitement and nervousness. "Mr. and Mrs. Salazar," she greeted, "it's an honor to have you here on this special day for our community." Elena smiled, feeling an unexpected pride upon hearing how their shared surname was pronounced with respect. "The honor is ours, Miss Thompson," she responded. "Seeing this dream become reality means more than we can express." The small ceremony was simple but moving. Miss Thompson spoke about the importance of reading and knowledge, especially in territories where educational opportunities were limited. Reverend Gibson blessed the space and those who would use it, and finally, Eleanor and Mateo cut the symbolic ribbon that had been placed at the entrance. As the attendees entered to admire the newly installed shelves and carefully arranged books, Elena noticed that Vega was approaching them. Her instinct was to interpose her body between him and Mateo, but she restrained herself. They would face this together, as they had agreed. "What a moving spectacle," Vega commented with false cordiality. "The Salazars, pillars of the community, bringing culture to our humble town." Mateo looked at him directly, without hostility but also without the slightest warmth. "Each contributes according to their abilities, Vega," he responded. "Some build, others—" He left the sentence unfinished, but its meaning was clear. Vega widened his smile, revealing teeth too perfect for a man of the West. "I'm surprised to see you so composed," he continued, ignoring the indirect. "Especially after our little meeting in La Mesa Verde. How is the reconstruction of the cabin going?" Elena felt anger boiling inside her, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. "It's going well, thank you for asking," she responded with a sweetness that contradicted the ice in her eyes. "Things built with love tend to resist any attempt at destruction." Vega turned to her, studying her as if she were a curiosity on display. "Ah, Mrs. Salazar," he said, slightly inclining his head. "Or should I say, Miss Navarro, I'm glad to see that your past hasn't affected your position in the community." Before Elena could respond, Judge Fuentes' voice rose behind them. "Mr. Vega," he said, with the authority that only a representative of the law could invoke, "how unexpected to see you at a cultural event. May I ask if you've already presented that challenge you talked so much about?" Vega turned, momentarily disconcerted by the interruption. "We're preparing the necessary documentation, Judge," he responded, quickly recovering his composure. "These legal matters require time and precision." The judge nodded with a thoughtful expression. Of course," he agreed. "Although I must warn you that presenting claims without foundation can be considered an abuse of the judicial system. And the county court views such practices very poorly." Vega's smile faltered slightly. "My lawyers consider there is sufficient basis," he insisted, though with less conviction. "Your lawyers should review the precedent established in the case. Of Morrison versus Telford of 1878, the judge continued, as one who comments on the weather. A very similar case to the one you propose. The plaintiff not only lost, but was sentenced to pay all legal costs and a substantial compensation for moral damages." Elena observed the exchange, marveled by the judge's ability to dismantle Vega's threats without a single aggressive or out-of-place word. "I will consider your advice, Judge," Vega finally responded, his tone considerably less arrogant. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other commitments." He walked away with quick steps, his rigid back betraying the humiliation he was trying to hide. Judge Fuentes turned to them with a barely perceptible smile. "The library is an admirable achievement, Mrs. Salazar. he commented, as if the confrontation with Vega had never occurred. "My late wife would have greatly appreciated your initiative. She always said that books are the only true way to travel without moving from the spot." "Thank you, Judge," Elena responded, moved by the mention of the deceased wife, a personal detail that the usually reserved judge rarely shared. "And thank you also for the other thing." The judge made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "Ernesto Vega occasionally needs to be reminded that laws exist to protect everyone, not just those who have money or influence," he said. "Enjoy your day. You've earned it." When the judge moved away, Mateo took Elena's hand and gently squeezed it. "It seems we have more allies than we thought," he commented, observing how Isabel Mendoza and Judge Fuentes conversed animatedly next to one of the bookshelves. Elena nodded, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sun that bathed the town. "Perhaps it's time to stop seeing ourselves as outsiders," she responded. "This place, these people, they have become our home as much as the ranch." The celebration continued well into the afternoon. The town's children received their first library. Cards with amazement, adults examined the shelves with curiosity, and Elena noticed with particular satisfaction that many stopped especially at the section of Spanish books she had insisted on including. When they finally returned to the ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, bathing the landscape in golden and reddish hues. Elena, exhausted but deeply satisfied, observed the road that stretched before them, thinking about how each curve and elevation had become so familiar, so hers. "It's been a good day," Mateo commented, driving the carriage with the reins loose in his expert hands. Elena rested her head on his shoulder, a gesture of intimacy that had become natural between them. "The best," she agreed. "Despite Vega. Or perhaps thanks to him," Mateo reflected. "If he hadn't appeared with his threats, we wouldn't have had that conversation with the judge. We wouldn't have discovered that we had allies." Elena considered his words, finding in them a wisdom that resonated with Doña Carmen's teachings about fire and seeds. "It's curious how life works," she said. "Sometimes we need something to burn to be able to build something better in its place." Mateo looked at her briefly, his eyes reflecting the setting sun. "Like us," he responded softly. "A marriage that began as a practical agreement, transformed by the trials we've faced." Elena nodded, feeling that words were insufficient to express the depth of what they now shared. Instead of speaking, she sought his free hand and intertwined her fingers with his, a silent language that both had learned to speak fluently. The ranch appeared in sight, its buildings bathed in the light of sunset. It wasn't an elegant mansion like those Elena had known in Madrid. It didn't even have the basic comforts that many in the East would consider indispensable. But as she observed the smoke coming from the chimney, the stables where the horses neighed in recognition, the garden she had planted with her own hands, she knew with absolute certainty that there was no other place in the world where she would rather be. She had arrived as a desperate stranger, accepting a marriage with an unknown man as the last alternative to misery. And now she returned as an integral part of this place, of this life, of this man she had learned to love, not despite the circumstances, but through them. Like the desert seeds that bloomed after fire, her heart had found ways to grow in the most unlikely terrain. And as the carriage crossed the gates of the ranch, Eleanor knew that she was, finally, home. Summer extended over the territory like a mantle of gold and heat. The days lengthened, allowing work days that began with the first ray of sun and ended when the stars were already twinkling in the firmament. At the Lone Eagle Ranch, the routine had subtly transformed, incorporating new elements that reflected the evolution of its inhabitants. Each morning, before the heat became relentless, Elena and Mateo rode together to La Mesa Verde. The reconstruction of the cabin advanced with constant determination, each stone placed, each beam secured, an act of resistance against those who had tried to snatch away their dream. The new structure was more solid than the previous one, with adobe and stone walls that would better resist both the elements and any malicious attempt at destruction. Mateo had insisted on building a small library in one of the rooms, a space that would be just for Elena, with mesquite wood shelves that he himself had carved during the nights. This morning, as they worked side by side placing the roof tiles, Elena paused a moment to contemplate the landscape that stretched before them. La Mesa Verde shone with life. The recent rains had intensified its greenness, and the small stream that crossed it sparkled like a silver ribbon under the sun. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," she commented, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Matteo followed her gaze, nodding in silent agreement. "My father always said this place had magic," he responded, "that the land here speaks if you know how to listen." Elena smiled, recognizing in those words the same kind of wisdom that Doña Carmen shared about the desert and its secrets. "And what does it tell you now?" she asked, genuinely curious. Matteo considered the question for a moment, his eyes traversing the gentle undulations of the plateau. "It tells me that we belong here," he finally responded, "that what we're building has roots deeper than just wood and stone." Elena let his words settle in her heart, feeling their truth resonate within her. Almost 2 months had passed since the fire, since Vega's threats, since that revelation that had shaken the foundations of their relationship. And in that time, something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer two people united by a practical agreement, not even two lovers discovering unexpected feelings. They had become companions in the deepest sense of the word, two beings who had consciously chosen to build a life together after having faced the possibility of losing everything. "Next week it will be finished," said Matteo, turning his attention back to the tiles, at least enough to start inhabiting it. Elena looked at him with surprise. "Inhabiting it?" she repeated. "I thought we were just building it to secure the claim, not to live here." Matteo left his work and approached her, his eyes revealing a vulnerability that he rarely allowed others to see. "I've been thinking," he began, carefully choosing his words. "The ranch is running well. Tomas can take care of daily supervision, and we could come here. Not permanently, but for seasons." He made a gesture that encompassed the half-finished structure and the surrounding landscape. "This place was always my father's dream," he continued. "A place of his own, away from others' gazes and judgments. And now it's our dream too, isn't it?" Elena felt her heart expanding at the implication of his words. It wasn't just a cabin they were building, but a shared future, a space that would be just theirs, free from the ghosts of the past and others' expectations. "I would love that," she responded, and the simplicity of her words contrasted with the depth of the emotion that accompanied them. Matteo's smile illuminated his sun-tanned face, softening the lines that years of worry had carved around his eyes. "Then it's decided," he said, sealing the agreement with a kiss that tasted of sun and promises. They returned to work with renewed energy, as if the cabin had taken on an even deeper meaning. It was no longer just an affirmation of property or an act of resistance against Vega. It was the beginning of a new phase in their shared life, a space that would reflect who they were now, not who they had been forced to be. At sunset, as they gathered the tools and prepared the horses for the return to the ranch, Elena noticed a figure approaching from the north. Her first instinct was alarm. Visits to La Mesa Verde were rare, and Vega's recent threats had left a latent distrust toward any unexpected presence. Matteo saw it too. With a fluid movement that spoke of years living in a territory where vigilance was necessary, he took the rifle he always carried during these trips and kept it ready, though not pointing directly at the rider who was approaching. As the figure drew closer, the last rays of the sun revealed a young man that Elena recognized as one of the Henderson children, a family that had established a small farm north of La Mesa Verde. "Mr. Salazar," called the boy, waving an arm with urgency. "My father sends me. There's trouble at the ranch." Elena felt her blood freezing. She exchanged a quick look with Matteo, whose eyes reflected the essay. "Me concern," she felt. "What kind of trouble, boy?" he asked, lowering the rifle as the young man dismounted in front of them. "Vega's men," the boy responded, breathing heavily. "My father saw them heading toward the Lone Eagle with torches. He says they looked like they were looking for trouble." Matteo cursed under his breath, a sound so unusual for him that Elena felt fear intensifying. "How many men?" he asked, already moving toward his horse. "At least 6, the boy responded. "My father sent my brother to town to alert the sheriff, but he wanted to make sure you knew too." Elena was already mounting, her mind quickly calculating. The ranch would be practically empty at this hour. Doña Carmen would have already returned to her house in town, and most of the workers would be in the south field, too far to offer immediate help. "Go with your father, Ethan," Mateo ordered the boy. "Thank him for his warning and tell him to stay away. This is between Vega and us." The return journey to the ranch was vertiginous, the horses spurred to the limit of their endurance. The sun had already set when they spotted the first signs of trouble, an orange glow that shouldn't be there, too intense to be the usual ranch lights. "Fire!" exclaimed Elena, feeling panic threatening to choke her. Mateo didn't respond, but the tension in his posture spoke for itself. When they finally reached the ridge that gave a view of the ranch, the scene they found confirmed their worst fears. The main barn was engulfed in flames, the fire rapidly spreading toward the stables. Dark figures moved in the yard, and the terrified neighing of the horses reached them even at this distance. "Elena," Mateo's voice cut through her horror, "go to town, seek help, bring the sheriff." She looked at him with disbelief. "I'm not going to leave you alone," she protested. Mateo's expression softened briefly, despite the urgency of the moment. "I'm not alone," he responded. "Tomas and the boys must be on their way from the south field, but we need additional help. And someone must ensure that the sheriff understands what's happening." Elena knew he was right, but the idea of separating at such a time was unbearable to her. "Be careful," she pleaded, her voice breaking slightly. "Please." Mateo leaned from his horse and kissed her briefly, a fleeting contact, but loaded with promises. "Always," he responded, before straightening and looking at her with an intensity that etched his image in her memory. "I'll see you soon." And with those words, he spurred his horse and launched down the hill toward the chaos that had been their shared home. Elena remained motionless for a second, divided between duty and the desperate desire to follow him. Finally, with a supreme effort of will, she directed her mount to the west where the road led to Valle Sereno. The journey to town was a blurry nightmare. The darkness made navigation difficult, and more than once Elena feared she had strayed from the path. But the mare seemed to understand the urgency, staying on the route with a determination that matched that of her rider. When finally the lights of Valle Sereno appeared in the distance, Elena felt a momentary relief that quickly gave way to a new urgency. She rode directly to the sheriff's office, dismounting with such haste that she almost fell. Sheriff Dawson, a middle-aged man with a military past that was reflected in his always alert posture, rose from his desk, surprised by the abrupt entrance. "Mrs. Salazar," he exclaimed, "what's happening?" "The ranch," Elena managed to articulate, her breathing agitated from the ride and fear. "Vega's men. They've set fire to the barn. Mateo is there alone." She didn't need to say more. The sheriff was already taking his hat and belt with the pistol. "Robertson," he called to his deputy, who had appeared alerted by the noise. "Gather as many men as you can and stop by Judge Fuentes' house. He'll want to know about this." He turned to Elena, quickly evaluating her state. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" he asked, his tone professional but kind. Elena shook her head. "We were at La Mesa Verde when we were warned," she explained. "Mateo sent me to seek help while he went to the ranch." The sheriff nodded, recognizing the logic of the decision, though clearly concerned about the situation. "Stay here," he said, already heading for the door. "It's not safe for you to return alone," but Elena was already following him. "It's my home, Sheriff," she responded with a firmness that admitted no discussion. "And my husband is there." Dawson looked at her for a moment, as if evaluating her determination. Finally, he nodded. "Stay close to me then," he conceded. "And follow my instructions to the letter." The group that departed from Valle Sereno included the sheriff, his deputy, 5 armed volunteers, and, to Elena's surprise, Judge Fuentes, who had insisted on accompanying them as a representative of the law. "This has gone too far," he had said upon joining them, his usually impassive face showing genuine indignation. It's time for Vega to face the consequences of his actions. The return journey seemed endless, despite the fact that they were riding at full speed. Elena felt that every minute that passed could mean the difference between finding Mateo safe, or she didn't allow her mind to complete that thought. When they finally spotted the ranch, the scene had changed. The barn was still burning, but the fire seemed to be under control in other areas. Figures moved in the yard, some carrying buckets of water, others forming a chain to combat the flames. "There!" exclaimed the sheriff's deputy, pointing toward a group of men who seemed to be confronting each other at the edge of the yard. The sheriff spurred his horse, advancing ahead of the group. Elena followed him, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force that she feared it might burst. As they drew closer, the scene became clearer. Mateo and Tomas, along with 3 workers, were facing a group led by Ernesto Vega. The tension was palpable, and though they hadn't reached for weapons, it was evident that the situation could explode at any moment. "Vega!" The sheriff's voice cut through the crackling of the fire and the angry voices. "Stay where you are!" The arrival of the Valle Sereno group instantly changed the dynamic. Vega and his men turned, clearly surprised by the presence of the law. Elena desperately searched for Mateo among the group. When she finally found him, the relief she felt was so intense it almost made her cry. He was alive, standing, though his face was stained with soot and dried blood marked a cut on his forehead. The sheriff dismounted, followed by his deputy and Judge Fuentes. The volunteers remained on horseback, forming a semicircle that effectively surrounded Vega and his men. "What's happening here, Vega?" asked Dawson, his hand resting casually near his weapon. Vega adopted an expression of offended innocence. "We came to warn Salazar about a fire we saw from our ranch," he responded, his voice a study in feigned concern. "But when we arrived it was already too late. The barn was in flames." "Lie!" Tomas's voice rose firm and clear. "We saw them, Sheriff. They arrived with torches, shouting that Salazar was going to learn a lesson." One of the workers nodded vigorously. "They also tried to set fire to the stables," he added. "If we hadn't arrived in time from the south field, the entire ranch would be burning now. The word of Mexican workers against mine," he commented, looking at the sheriff with arrogance. "Sure, that will carry a lot of weight in court." It was then that Judge Fuentes stepped forward, his small figure but intimidating in his authority. "My word is also involved, Mr. Vega," he said, his voice calm but charged with weight. "And that of Mrs. Salazar, and that of young Henderson, who saw your men heading here with torches." Vega's face lost some of its confidence. "You can't prove anything," he insisted, though with less conviction. "I don't need to prove anything here and now," responded the judge. "But there are enough witnesses and evidence to justify your arrest and a formal trial." He turned to the sheriff, who had already taken handcuffs from his belt. "Sheriff Dawson, proceed with the arrest of Mr. Vega and his accomplices for arson, attempted destruction of property, and threats against legitimate citizens of the territory." What followed was almost anticlimactic. Vega, seeing that he was completely outnumbered in both numbers and authority, offered no physical resistance to the arrest. His men, following his example, allowed themselves to be handcuffed without fighting, although their faces reflected a mixture of resentment and fear. While the sheriff and his deputy dealt with the prisoners, Elena ran to Mateo. He received her, with open arms, enveloping her in an embrace that said more than any word. "You're safe," she murmured against his chest, tears finally finding their way down her cheeks. "I thought that—" "I'm fine," he reassured her, his voice hoarse from smoke and emotion. "We arrived just as they were starting. Tomas and the boys appeared shortly after. We couldn't save the barn, but the rest of the ranch is safe." Elena moved back slightly to study his face, her fingers gently tracing the cut on his forehead. "This?" she asked, concerned. Mateo sketched a tired smile. "Oh, falling beam," he explained. "Nothing serious, Elena, no." Dead, absorbing every detail of his face, as if wanting to memorize it anew. The intensity of her fear at thinking she might lose him had surprised her, revealing the depth of her feelings in a way that not even their most intimate moments had achieved. Judge Fuentes approached them, his expression softened by something resembling empathy. "Vega will face justice this time," he said. "I'll personally make sure of it." Mateo extended his hand, which the judge shook firmly. "Thank you," he said simply, but the word contained all the gratitude that he couldn't adequately express. The judge nodded, understanding what was unsaid. "This wouldn't have happened if I had acted sooner," he admitted. "I knew Vega was a problematic element, but I underestimated how far his obsession with La Mesa Verde would go. The important thing is that he's detained now, Elena intervened, and that no one was seriously injured. While they spoke, the volunteers and workers had formed a more efficient chain to combat the fire. The barn was lost, but they had managed to contain the flames and protect the rest of the structures. "You should come to town for tonight," suggested the judge. "At least until we're sure that all of Vega's men have been located," but Mateo shook his head. "For this is our home," he responded, his arm still around Elena's shoulders. "We won't leave, especially not tonight. The men need to know that we're here, that we don't flee at the first sign of trouble." The judge seemed to understand the importance of that symbolism. He nodded briefly. "As you wish," he conceded. "I'll leave 2 of the volunteers as additional guard, just in case." While the sheriff and his group prepared to take the prisoners away, Elena observed the aftermath of the attack. The barn, reduced to a charred structure that still smoked under the starry sky. The tired but determined faces of the workers who had defended the ranch. The corral where the horses, finally calmed, grouped together seeking mutual safety. But in the midst of the destruction, she also felt a strange sensation of hope? No, it was more than that. It was the certainty that what Vega had tried to destroy, their home, their security, their belonging to this place, had actually been strengthened by his attack, like the cabin in La Mesa Verde, rebuilt stronger after the fire. Like her relationship with Mateo, deeper and truer after facing hidden truths and unexpressed fears. "What are you thinking about?" asked Mateo, noticing her distant gaze. Elena turned her attention to him, to the man who had gone from being a stranger to being the center of her world. "That some things need to be destroyed to be rebuilt better," she responded. "Like this ranch, like us." Mateo nodded slowly, understanding the depth of what she was expressing. "We will rebuild," he promised, his gaze encompassing the visible damages and also the invisible wounds that the night had inflicted. Everything. And as they entered the house that remained standing, intact despite Vega's efforts, Elena knew that promise extended far beyond the physical structures. It was a promise of future, of permanence, of a shared life that no fire could reduce to ashes. Autumn arrived in the territory, with gentle winds that whispered secrets among the mesquites and carried the aroma of moist earth and late flowers. In La Mesa Verde, the finally completed cabin stood as a testimony to perseverance. Thick and warm adobe walls, windows strategically placed to capture the changing sunlight, a wide porch where 2 rocking chairs awaited evening conversations. Elena contemplated the space from the threshold of what would be her room shared with Mateo. The bed they had brought from the ranch, the shelves filled with carefully selected books, the desk by the window where natural light would be perfect for writing or drawing. Everything spoke of permanence, of an imagined future built with their own hands. The trial against Ernesto Vega had concluded the previous week. The verdict hadn't surprised anyone. Guilty of premeditated arson, destruction of property, and threats. The sentence, 5 years in the territorial prison, had been exemplary, a clear message that not even men with money and influence were above the law. The reconstruction of the barn at the Lone Eagle Ranch had also finished, thanks to the help of neighbors and friends who had shown up spontaneously after the fire. That act of community solidarity had deeply moved Elena and Mateo, confirming what they were already beginning to feel, that they had ceased to be outsiders, to become an integral part of the social fabric of the territory. Elena heard footsteps on the porch and smiled, recognizing the familiar rhythm of Mateo's boots. She had become accustomed to identifying his presence by small details, the sound of his steps, the particular way he opened doors, even his breathing in the silence of the night. They were the intimate knowledge that is only acquired through daily coexistence, from sharing space and time, joys and sorrows. "Here you are," he said, appearing in the doorway. "Tomas just left. He says everything is in order at the ranch, and that Doña Carmen threatens to come herself to find us if we don't return for the harvest celebration." Elena laughed softly, perfectly imagining the determination of the elderly cook who had become an almost maternal figure for both. "I wouldn't dare to defy her," she responded, approaching him. Besides, I promised Isabel I would help her with the preparations for the party. Matteo nodded, but there was something in his gaze that suggested he had other thoughts in mind. He took Eleanor's hands in his, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Before returning, he began with an unusual note of nervousness in his usually confident voice. "There's something I want to show you." Intrigued, Elena followed him outside the cabin. The mid-afternoon sun bathed La Mesa Verde in a golden light that softened all contours, transforming the landscape into something almost dreamlike. Matteo guided her to the western end of the property, where the land descended gently toward a small valley protected by rock formations. Elena had never explored this part of La Mesa Verde, assuming it was simply an extension of the grazing land. When they finally reached what appeared to be their destination, she stopped in surprise. Before them stretched a small orchard, newly planted but already showing the first signs of life. Young fruit trees, their trunks thin but firm, lined up in orderly rows. Between them, carefully prepared patches of earth showed small green shoots that Elena recognized as aromatic herbs and flowers. "Matteo," she murmured, speechless at the surprise. He observed her with a mixture of pride and nervousness, like a child presenting a handmade gift, unsure of its reception. "I've been preparing it during the past few weeks," he explained. "While we finished the cabin, I wanted it to be a surprise." Eleanor slowly walked through the orchard, recognizing with amazement the species he had chosen, orange and lemon trees that recalled her childhood in Spain, medicinal plants that Doña Carmen had taught her to value, wildflowers she had mentioned loving during their walks. "How?" She began, overwhelmed by the attention to every detail. "I asked Isabel about Spanish plants that might adapt here," Matteo explained, following her through the orchard. "And Doña Carmen helped me with the local herbs. The soil here is special, richer than in the rest of the plateau. My father used to say it was like a secret that the earth kept for whoever knew how to listen to it." Eleanor stopped in front of a small shrub that she immediately recognized. Rosemary, the plant her mother had cultivated in the patio of their house in Madrid. The aroma, released by gently brushing the leaves with her fingers, instantly transported her to her childhood, to almost forgotten moments of security and belonging. "It's perfect," she said, her voice broken by emotion. "All these years wandering, and I never thought I would have my own garden again." Matteo approached, and with a delicacy that contrasted with his hands hardened by work, dried a tear that Elena hadn't even noticed had escaped. "There's something else," he said, guiding her to a small clearing in the center of the orchard. There, protected by a simple but elegant wooden structure, was a stone bench. But it wasn't just any bench. It was carved with motifs that mixed traditional symbols of the territory with elements that Elena recognized from Spanish architecture. "I made it myself," Matteo explained, with barely contained pride. "Tomás helped. Me with the larger stones, but the carving, I wanted it to be special." Elena traced the intricate designs with her fingers, marveled by the work and the meaning they contained. It was a perfect fusion of their worlds, a bridge between her past and her present. "It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen," she said, sitting on the bench and inviting Matteo to join her. He sat beside her, their shoulders touching in a contact as familiar as it was comforting. "I wanted to create a space that was just yours," he explained, "a place where you could come when you needed peace or when you missed your land." Elena rested her head on Matteo's shoulder, letting emotions flow freely. The gesture, so intimate and vulnerable, contained everything she couldn't express with words. Gratitude for his understanding, amazement at his generosity, the depth of love that had blossomed between them against all odds. "Ours," she gently corrected. "A place that is ours." They remained like that for a long moment, wrapped in a silence that didn't need to be filled with words. The gentle wind swayed the young branches of the trees, creating subtle music that accompanied their thoughts. "When I arrived in this country," Elena finally said, "I believed I had lost everything that defined me, my home, my family, my roots. I felt uprooted, like a plant torn from its soil." Matteo listened attentively, his hand finding hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "And then I found you," she continued. Or perhaps we found each other, two wounded, distrustful people, clinging to the little they had left. She paused, searching for the precise words to express what she felt. I never imagined that a marriage of convenience, a practical agreement between strangers, could transform into this, into a real home, into true love, into the feeling of belonging to some place and to someone. Matteo nodded, perfectly understanding what she expressed because he had traveled the same inner path. My father used to say that the strongest plants are those that have been transplanted, he said, because they develop deeper roots, seeking stability. He took Elena's face between his hands with a delicacy that contrasted with his physical strength. You are the root that has anchored me, Elena, he continued, his voice hoarse with emotion. When I proposed that absurd marriage to you, I was desperate to save La Mesa Verde, to fulfill the promise I made to my father. I never imagined I would find much more than land. I found a home. I found peace. I found you. The words floated between them like a blessing, like a vow more meaningful than any they had exchanged before Judge Fuentes that day that seemed to belong to another life. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, bathing the orchard, in warm hues that transformed the green leaves into liquid gold. In the distance, a hawk traced lazy circles in the sky, free and serene in its flight. Do you know what I like most about this place? Elena asked after a moment. The silence. Not the silence of solitude or abandonment, but this living silence full of small sounds that remind you that you are part of something larger. Matteo nodded, understanding exactly what she was referring to. It's the silence that speaks, he responded. The one that allows you to hear what truly matters. He stood and extended his hand to her, a gesture that contained both an offering and a promise. Let's go, he said. We still have to prepare for returning to the ranch tomorrow, and the road is long. Elena took his hand and stood, but before moving away from the orchard, she stopped to contemplate it one more time. In her mind she could see how it would be in a few years, the trees grown and laden with fruits, the flowers extending their colors in all directions, the stone bench aged by the seasons but more beautiful for the stories it would have witnessed. As they returned to the cabin, holding hands like teenagers in their first love, Elena thought about the long and winding road that had brought her here, from her father's library in Madrid to this remote corner of Arizona. From the desperation that led her to accept a marriage with a stranger to the deep and true love they now shared. She remembered Matteo's absurd proposal that first day, his insistence that they must marry before sunset. She remembered her fear, her initial distrust, the way they had carefully circled around each other, like wounded animals fearful of new pain. And she also remembered every small moment that had built the bridge between them, the key he had given her. The first time they worked together on the cabin, the night of the flood when they discovered they formed a natural team, the medallion with the image of La Mesa Verde, their first true kiss by the fire. They had faced literal and metaphorical fires. They had seen what they had built burn, and had rebuilt it stronger. They had found unexpected allies and faced determined enemies. They had discovered that hidden truths, once exposed to light, lost their power to harm. And through all of it, they had woven something precious and rare, a love that wasn't based on romantic illusions or ephemeral passions, but on the conscious and daily choice to build a shared life, to face together whatever might come. Upon reaching the cabin, Matteo stopped on the porch. The evening light outlined his silhouette, softening the hard angles of his face weathered by sun and worries. "Welcome home, Elena Salazar," he said with a smile that completely transformed his usually serious expression. She approached and placed a hand on his cheek, feeling the familiar texture of his incipient beard under her fingers. "I am home, Matteo." "Salazar," she responded, and the words contained a truth as deep as the sky that stretched above them. "At last I am home." As the sun set over La Mesa Verde, tinting the horizon with promises of a new dawn, Elena understood that she had found what her heart had always sought. Not a geographical place, not a structure of wood and stone, but that invisible yet tangible space that is created when two souls recognize each other and decide to walk together. A home built not only with hands, but with hearts. A shared silence that speaks more eloquently than 1,000 words. A peace that comes, finally, when you understand that you belong exactly where you are, with exactly whom you are with. And in that silence of La Mesa Verde, two people who had begun as strangers united by desperation found the most improbable and true of love stories, their own.